What would you do if everything you owned was stolen from you in an instant, and your only path forward was to purchase the one thing no one else on earth would ever want? For 18-year-old Jane Haskins, a single $2 bill was the humiliating price of a ruined outlaw's cabin, a place so feared and reviled it had been left to the mercy of the Wyoming seasons. But the truth buried beneath its rotting floorboards would prove that the most dismissed places often hold the most valuable secrets. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of courage and resilience on the far, unforgiving edge of the American frontier. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on Jane's worn boots, a fine red powder that felt like the grit of her own life settling into every crack and seam. It had been a week since her guardian, a man she'd called Uncle, had sold the family claim from under her. Thaddeus, her father's half-brother, had arrived with a sad face and a satchel full of legal papers she couldn't read, explaining that the debts were too great. The ranch her father had carved out of the wilderness with his own two hands, the house whose every board he had sawn and set, was gone. The memory of those hands, broad and calloused, was a fresh and constant ache in her chest. Now, she stood with nothing but the threadbare dress on her back, a thin blanket roll, a few carefully folded dollars, and the one thing she'd fought to keep, her father's felling axe, its handle worn smooth as riverstone from his grip. The town was no comfort. It was a place of sidelong glances and sharp, whispered judgments. She was an orphan again, but worse this time. At 10, when her parents had succumbed to winter fever within a day of each other, she was a tragedy to be pitied. At 18, cast out and penniless, she was a problem to be avoided. She saw the notice tacked to the post outside the assayer's office, its corner flapping in the dry wind. A public auction of seized and abandoned properties. Most were mining claims or lots in town she could never afford. Then her eyes fell on the last item, scrawled in hasty ink at the bottom of the page, the Blackwood cabin, sold as is. All claims forfeit. A current of recognition, cold and sharp, went through the small crowd that milled nearby. Men nudged each other. A woman pulled her child closer. Jane had heard the stories. The cabin was a place of bad luck and bad blood, the last known hideout of the outlaw Shadow Sykes, who'd been gunned down on its porch 5 years prior. They said his ghost still lingered, soured by betrayal, and that the ground itself was cursed. Jane felt a strange kinship with the idea of a place haunted by betrayal. She looked from the notice to the distant dark line of the Blackwood Ridge, then down at the few dollars clutched in her hand. A flicker of something hard and defiant, something she hadn't felt in weeks, began to burn behind her eyes. She would go to the auction. She had nothing left to lose, not even her dignity. That had been sold right along with her father's land. The auction took place in the dusty clearing between the saloon and the livery stable, a makeshift stage for the town's small dramas. Mr. Abernathy, the portly auctioneer, worked his way through the list of properties with a practiced, booming voice. Claims were sold, debts were settled, and fortunes, however small, were redistributed under the harsh afternoon sun. Jane stood at the very back, a slight, still figure wrapped in a silence that set her apart from the boisterous crowd. She kept her hand on the head of her father's axe, which leaned against her leg, its familiar weight a small anchor in the churning sea of her uncertainty. Finally, Abernathy reached the last item. "All right, folks, last on the docket." He cleared his throat and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The Blackwood cabin. Up on the ridge. You all know the one. A nervous titter ran through the crowd. He didn't need to elaborate. The story of Shadow Sykes was woven into the town's brief history. A ghost story told to frighten children and newcomers. Place is half fallen, full of rot and varmints, and likely the ghost of Sykes himself, the auctioneer continued, a smirk playing on his lips. So we'll start the bidding low. Who'll give me $5 for the land and the lumber? Silence, a heavy, absolute silence broken only by the buzz of flies and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Men shuffled their feet and looked away. $5 was a pittance for any piece of land, however remote. But no one wanted the stigma. No one wanted to invite that kind of trouble, spectral or otherwise, into their lives. Abernathy's smirk widened into a grin. $5 for a roof over your head, boys. Even a leaky one. More silence. From the front of the crowd, a well-dressed, heavy-set man laughed out loud. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, and the man who held sway over most of the town's business. "You'd have to pay me to haul that garbage away, Abernathy," Croft boomed, and his cronies chuckled along with him. Abernathy's face fell slightly. He sighed, ready to dismiss the lot. "All right then, anyone? Any bid at all? $1, just to clear the books?" He looked around, his gaze passing over Jane without seeing her. In the ringing silence, a clear, steady voice, surprisingly loud for coming from such a slight frame, cut through the air. $2. Every head turned. The crowd parted as if by a silent command, revealing Jane standing alone at the back, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the auctioneer. For a moment, there was only stunned disbelief. Then, a low wave of laughter started, beginning with Croft and spreading through the rest. It wasn't friendly laughter. It was sharp and cruel. Jane's face burned, but she did not look away. Abernathy stared at her, his mouth half open. "The girl bids $2, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at Croft, at the other men. $2. Going once? The laughter was his answer. Going twice? He looked back at Jane, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. Sold, he mumbled, bringing the gavel down on his ledger with a dull thud. To the girl. For $2. Jane walked forward, the whispers of the crowd like a physical force against her. She placed 2 worn dollar bills on the ledger, took the deed Abernathy had hastily signed, and turned to leave. As she passed, Silas Croft stepped into her path. "Enjoy the splinters, girl," he sneered, his eyes cold and dismissive. "And the nightmares." Jane said nothing. She simply walked past him, clutching the flimsy piece of paper that was now her only possession in the world. The town's mocking laughter a bitter song at her back. Did she just buy her own grave? Or is there a reason the outlaw chose that specific, forgotten place? Let us know what you think is hidden in that old cabin down in the comments. And be sure to subscribe for the rest of the story. Because when Jane finally reached the property line, the silence that greeted her was older and deeper than any ghost. The purchase of the cabin solidified Jane's status as a pariah. Before, she was an unfortunate stray. Now, she was the town fool. The whispers that had followed her turned into open stares and poorly concealed smirks. When she walked into the Redemption Gulch General Store to spend the last of her money, the small group of men loafing by the stove fell silent, watching her as if she were a peculiar and slightly dangerous animal. The storekeeper, a man who had known her father, suddenly found it hard to meet her eyes. He weighed her flour and salt with a heavy hand, his thumb seeming to press on the scale. The prices he quoted were higher than they had been a week ago, a silent tax on her foolishness. Jane paid without complaint, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. She was counting out her coins when the door swung open and Silas Croft entered, filling the space with his bulk and his booming voice. He saw her immediately. Well, he said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Stocking the larder for your new palace? Be sure to get extra traps. I hear the rats on Blackwood Ridge are as big as house cats." His companions, a pair of ranch hands with mean eyes, laughed on cue. Jane ignored him, gathering her small sacks. She was acutely aware of every eye in the store on her, of the suffocating weight of their collective judgment. She turned to leave, her only thought to get away, to breathe air that wasn't thick with contempt. As she pushed the door open, a hand gently touched her arm. She flinched, expecting another jibe, But it was Ilara, the town's laundress. Ilara was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands permanently puckered from soap and water. She was a fixture in the town, as silent and enduring as the mountains, and most people paid her no mind. She pressed a small, cloth-wrapped parcel into Jane's hand. It was unexpectedly warm and smelled of dried herbs. "Some ground don't forget," Ilara murmured, her voice a dry, rustling whisper like autumn leaves. "It remembers who works it." Jane stared at her, uncomprehending. The old woman's dark eyes held a strange, knowing light. Before Jane could form a question, Ilara gave a short, sharp nod and shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Jane looked down at the parcel of herbs, then back at the door of the general store. The laughter had subsided, but the feeling of being an outsider was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She clutched the warm herbs, the strange words echoing in her mind. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a blessing. It was something else, something she couldn't yet name. With the town at her back, she adjusted the weight of her pack and started the long walk toward the ridge, toward the cursed ground that was now her only home. The journey to the Blackwood cabin was a pilgrimage of solitude. The path that led from town quickly dwindled from a wagon-rutted road to a faint deer trail, and then to nothing at all. Jane followed the deed's crude map, keeping the chattering waters of Granite Creek to her left as she climbed. She had no horse, no wagon, only what she could carry on her own 2 feet. Her pack was heavy with flour, salt, and a small sack of nails, but the heaviest thing she carried was her father's axe, its hickory handle strapped to the outside of her blanket roll. With every step upward, the air grew thinner and cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon's tinny piano, the chorus of derision, faded, replaced by the sigh of the wind in the high pines and the scolding cry of a jay. The land was beautiful in a way that was both breathtaking and deeply intimidating. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, and the valleys were choked with shadows that seemed to hold their breath. This was a world that did not care for human concerns. It was vast, indifferent, and watchful. She arrived at dusk, the time of day when the world turns from gold to gray. The clearing appeared suddenly, a wound in the dense forest, and in its center stood the cabin. It was worse than she had imagined, worse than the stories. The roof on one side had collapsed into a skeletal grin, and the porch sagged as if it had knelt in defeat years ago. A door hung from a single leather hinge, creaking a mournful rhythm in the breeze. Boards were missing from the walls, leaving dark, staring gaps. The whole structure leaned, looking as though a strong gust of wind might push it over entirely. It smelled of rot, of mildew, of the deep, final sorrow of abandonment. A wave of despair, cold and sickening, washed over Jane. She had traded the last of her money and all of her pride for this pile of decaying logs. The laughter of the town echoed in her ears, and for a moment she was tempted to turn around, to walk back down the mountain and face whatever humiliation awaited her. But where would she go? Back to being a burden? A charity case? Back to the pity and the scorn? No. Her jaw tightened. She had bought this place. It was hers. The thought was as grim as the cabin itself. She slid the heavy pack from her shoulders, her muscles screaming in protest. She would not sleep inside that ruin tonight. Not yet. She untied her father's axe. The familiar weight of it in her hands was a comfort. She found a stand of deadfall pine at the edge of the clearing and, with steady, practiced swings, began to chop firewood. The sharp thwack of the steel biting into wood was a satisfying, defiant sound in the immense quiet. She built a small, careful fire a safe distance from the cabin, cooked a miserable meal of flour and water paste on a hot stone, and wrapped herself in her thin blanket. She lay with her back against a large boulder, the axe resting by her side, its polished edge gleaming in the firelight. Above her, the sky was a black velvet cloth punched through, with a brilliant spray of stars. There was no sound but the crackle of her fire and the low moan of the wind through the broken cabin. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in weeks, it felt less like a punishment and more like a simple fact. The first days on Blackwood Ridge were a brutal education in the art of survival. Jane woke each morning to the bone-deep chill of the high country. Her first task to coax the embers of her fire back to life. She worked from dawn until dusk, driven by a desperate, silent urgency. The cabin was not a home. It was a hostile entity, a collection of problems to be solved. She used the axe to fell a young pine, and with painstaking effort, stripped its branches and cut crude planks to patch the gaping holes in the walls. She gathered moss and clay from the creek bed, mixing a thick plaster to chink the gaps between the logs, her hands quickly becoming raw and caked with mud. She found a spring of clear, cold water a short walk from the clearing, a small blessing that felt like a major victory. The work was relentless, her body a symphony of aches and pains. But with each repaired wall, with each sealed crack, a sliver of despair was replaced by a sliver of ownership. A week passed. The cabin, while still a grim and sorry sight, was now weathertight, if not welcoming. One afternoon, as a cold rain began to fall, Jane turned her attention to the interior. The floor was a treacherous landscape of dirt, animal droppings, and decades of accumulated leaves. As she swept the debris towards the broken hearth, her makeshift broom of pine boughs snagged on a floorboard. It was loose, like many of the others. But this one felt different. It shifted under her weight with a distinct seesaw motion, not the spongy give of rot. She knelt, pushing aside the grime. The board was oak, unlike the pine of the surrounding floor, and it seemed to sit slightly higher. She made a mental note of it, too tired and overwhelmed to investigate further. Her focus was on the immediate, a dry place to sleep. As she spent more time in the clearing, she began to notice the quiet rhythms of the place. The animals were strangely unafraid. A doe and her fawn would often graze at the edge of the woods, watching her with dark, curious eyes. A large hawk circled high above the clearing every afternoon, its sharp cries the only punctuation in the long, silent hours. It never seemed to hunt in the valley, only to watch. It was a strange, persistent vigilance. She felt less like an intruder and more like an object of quiet observation. One evening, exhausted, she sat on the porch step, which she had shored up with a few sturdy rocks. Her eyes fell on the threshold stone, the large, flat rock that formed the entrance. She had crossed it 100 times without a thought. But now, in the low, slanted light of dusk, she saw it clearly. It was not the rough, gray granite of the surrounding mountainside. It was a slab of dark green river slate, worn smooth by water and time, and on its edge, almost hidden by shadow, was a small, deliberately carved symbol, a simple spiral. It was out of place, just like the oak floorboard. The cabin was still a wreck, but it was beginning to feel less like a place of simple decay and more like a place of secrets. Jane ran her fingers over the cool, smooth spiral, a question forming in her mind for the first time. Why? The sight of a man on horseback at the edge of her clearing sent a jolt of alarm through Jane. She instinctively reached for her axe, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The rider wasn't from the town's usual crowd of loafers. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture easy and competent, on a fine-boned bay that watched her with intelligent eyes. He wore a dusty hat and a practical canvas coat, and his face, weathered by sun and wind, held a look of quiet curiosity rather than malice. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. "Saw your smoke from my ridge. Figured I'd see who was brave enough to take on the old Sykes place." He dismounted, his movements unhurried, and looped the reins around a low-hanging branch. "Name's Will Kincaid. My ranch borders this land to the west." Jane remained silent, wary. She knew the Kincaid name. His ranch was a smaller operation than Croft's, but well regarded. "Jane Haskins," she finally said, her voice tight. Will nodded, his eyes taking in the patched walls, the newly cleared yard, the stack of firewood. He didn't mock, he didn't pity, he simply assessed. "You've been busy," he remarked. This place was ready to fall to its knees. He walked over to the main wall and pressed a hand against the logs. "Still is," he added, more to himself than to her. "That main beam is giving way. A good snow and the whole thing will come down on top of you." He looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "I'm not here to trouble you, Miss Haskins, but I can't in good conscience leave you to face a Wyoming winter in this state. I've got some tools and some experience. I'd be obliged if you'd let me help you shore up these walls." Jane was taken aback. It was the first offer of genuine help she'd received since losing her home. She looked from his steady, honest face to the leaning cabin. She knew he was right. She could patch holes, but she couldn't raise a sagging roofline on her own. "I can't pay you," she said, the words tasting like ash. Will Kincaid shook his head. "Wouldn't take it if you could. Let's just call it a neighborly investment in not having to pull you out of the wreckage come January." For the next 3 days, they worked side by side. Will was a quiet and patient teacher, showing her how to use a lever and fulcrum to lift the sagging beam, how to notch a new support post, how to secure it without compromising the old structure. His presence was a quiet, steadying force. They spoke little, the work itself a form of conversation. To properly brace the new posts, they had to clear the entire cabin floor. It was during this process that Jane pointed to the odd oak plank. "This one's different," she said. "It's not rotten." Will knelt beside her, running a calloused hand over the wood. He examined the edges closely. "No nail holes," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "And look here." He pointed to a small, almost invisible notch carved into the side, perfectly sized for a prying tool. A shared look of curiosity passed between them. This wasn't a repair, it was a feature. "Let's get this beam set," Will said, his voice even. "Then we'll see what this is all about." The labor, the shared purpose, was mending something in Jane that had felt irrevocably broken. As they worked, her father's axe leaned against the wall, a silent companion. The section ended with Will fitting the tip of his pry bar into the small notch. With a grunt of effort, he put his weight into it, and the board groaned, lifting slowly from its long hidden resting place. The air in the cabin grew thick with anticipation. The oak plank came away with a final, splintering sigh, revealing not the dark earth beneath, but a rectangular hollow neatly lined with oilcloth to keep out the damp. It was a secret space, deliberately made and carefully hidden. Will held the lantern high, its yellow light pushing back the shadows and illuminating the small cache. Jane knelt, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The hollow was just large enough to hold a single, stout leather satchel. It was dark with age, its surface unadorned, but it felt heavy with significance even before she touched it. With trembling fingers, she reached into the space. The leather was cold and stiff. She hooked her fingers under the straps and pulled. It was heavier than she expected. She lifted it out and set it on the dusty floor between them, the lantern light flickering over its worn surface. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the low whisper of the wind outside, a sound that suddenly felt like a held breath. Jane's fingers fumbled with the stiff brass buckles. They finally gave way with a rusty click. She lifted the heavy flap. The smell that rose from the satchel was the scent of things long hidden, dry paper, crumbling leather, and the faint metallic tang of ink. She reached inside and her fingers closed around a thick, crisp packet of papers. She drew it out into the lantern light. They were bearer bonds, issued by the Union Pacific Railroad, each one promising a sum that made her head swim. There were dozens of them. It was a fortune, more money than she could possibly imagine, lying there on the floor of a $2 cabin. Will let out a low whistle. Sykes wasn't just a rustler, he murmured, his eyes wide. Beneath the bonds was another, softer bundle, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Jane carefully untied it. They were letters. Not business, but personal. The handwriting was elegant, surprisingly so. They were love letters, written by the outlaw Shadow Sykes to a woman named Amelia. They spoke of a life he wished he could have, of regret, and of a deep, abiding bitterness. He wrote of being trapped, of being used by men who smiled at him in public and plotted with him in private. He was not the monster of the town's stories. He was a man cornered, betrayed, and fighting back in the only way he knew how. At the very bottom of the satchel lay one final object, a small, black, leather-bound ledger. It felt heavier than the bonds and letters combined. Jane took it, her hands shaking slightly, and opened it to the first page. The same elegant script from the letters filled the pages, but this was not poetry. It was an accounting. Dates, a description of services rendered, cattle driven from Croft North Range, silver shipment from the Blue Lode waylaid, and next to each entry, a name and a sum. At the top of the list, repeated more than any other, was the name Silas Croft. The ledger was a meticulous record of betrayal. It detailed, with chilling precision, how Croft and a half-dozen other respectable men of Redemption Gulch had hired Shadow Sykes to be their own personal disaster. They had paid him to rustle their own herds, raid their own freight, and create a reign of terror for which they could then collect handsome insurance payments and federal relief funds. Sykes, the feared outlaw, had been their employee. He was the shadow they had cast themselves to hide their greed. Jane looked up from the ledger, her eyes meeting Will's in the flickering light. The truth she now held was a weight far greater than gold, and far more dangerous. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the newly braced timbers groan. The lantern flame danced wildly, casting their elongated shadows against the walls like spectral giants. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised purple-gray, and the first hard pellets of snow began to hiss against the roof. The blizzard descended without warning, a white fury that erased the world, isolating their small, repaired cabin in a sea of swirling snow. The crisis had moved from the discovery in the satchel to the immediate reality of survival. The storm trapped them, forcing an intimacy and a reckoning. They built up the fire in the hearth, the warmth a small bastion against the howling wind. Will secured a blanket over the doorway while Jane made coffee. The ledger lay on the small, rough table between them, a silent, powerful presence. "What are you going to do?" Will finally asked, his voice low and serious, cutting through the storm's roar. Jane traced the name Silas Croft with her finger. "This isn't just about money," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "This is about everything. My father's ranch, Thaddeus said the debts were too great. How many of those debts were to him?" She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Croft's greed had likely swallowed her family's legacy. To reveal this ledger was not just to claim a fortune, it was to declare war on the man who owned the town, the man who had laughed at her ruin. As the storm reached its peak, a frantic, desperate banging rattled the door. It was a sound barely audible over the gale, thin and terrified. Will grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a club, and Jane held the lantern high as he pulled back the blanket. A man stood there, covered in snow, his face etched with panic. "Please," he begged, his teeth chattering. "My wife, the baby is coming." Our wagon broke an axle down the trail. Without a moment's hesitation, Jane pushed past Will. "Bring them in," she commanded. "We'll help the man carry his heavily pregnant wife inside, their small daughter, no older than 5, trailing behind them, weeping with cold and fear." Jane, who had been an outcast only days before, became a beacon of sanctuary. She gave the terrified woman her own blanket, brewed them tea with Alara's herbs, and gave the little girl the warmest spot by the fire. She moved with a quiet competence that amazed Will. This small, determined girl was transforming a cursed outlaw's hideout into a haven. Seeing her in action, her compassion and strength shining in the face of crisis, solidified something in Will's heart. This wasn't just about helping a neighbor. He looked at Jane, who was calmly reassuring the frightened mother, and he knew. "This is your land now, Jane," he said softly, so only she could hear. "Your truth. I'll stand with you." When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the grateful family departed, promising to tell everyone in Redemption Gulch of the angel on Blackwood Ridge who had saved them. The crisis had passed, and Jane's choice was made. She would not hide. She would carry the truth down the mountain. The return to Redemption Gulch was a different kind of journey. Jane and Will rode down the mountain together, Will's steady bay beside a gentle mare he had brought for her from his own remuda. The world was scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of new snow. By the time they reached the town, word had already preceded them. The family Jane had sheltered, the Millers, had kept their promise. The story of the girl in the haunted cabin who had saved a mother and newborn child during the blizzard had spread like wildfire, transforming Jane from the town fool into a local heroine. The stares that followed her now were not of scorn, but of awe and curiosity. People emerged from the storefronts and houses to watch them pass. Their whispers changed in tone. Silas Croft's narrative had been broken, replaced by a new, more compelling one. Jane knew the town's loyalty was a fickle thing, but it was a start. She did not go to the town sheriff. The ledger implicated too many people for her to trust local law. Instead, she and Will went to the hotel and waited. The circuit judge, a man named Elias Miller, was due to arrive that day. Judge Miller was a stern, uncompromising man with a reputation for ironclad fairness. When he arrived, Jane, with Will at her side, approached him in the hotel's dining room. In a clear, steady voice, she requested a public hearing. Intrigued by the strange request from the now famous girl from Blackwood Ridge, he agreed. The only space large enough to hold the gathered crowd was the saloon. That afternoon, the entire town crammed inside, the air thick with anticipation. Jane and Will stood before a large table at the front. With methodical calm, Jane laid out the contents of the satchel, the stack of Union Pacific bonds, the bundle of Sykes's tragic letters, and finally, the damning black ledger. Silas Croft, who had pushed his way to the front, turned purple with rage. "This is an outrage," he bellowed. "This girl is a thief and a liar. She probably stole these things." But then, a quiet man in a city suit, who had been traveling with the judge's party, stepped forward. "I am a claims agent with the Union Pacific Railroad," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. He picked up one of the bonds, examining it closely. "These are genuine. They are part of a shipment reported stolen and presumed lost 5 years ago." A gasp went through the crowd. The judge himself picked up the ledger, his face a grim mask as he scanned the pages. The dates, the names, the specific details, they were too precise to be a forgery. Other men in the room, smaller ranchers and merchants, whose names were also in the book, began to look at their feet, avoiding Croft's furious gaze. The chorus of the town had gone from mocking laughter to stunned silence, and now to a low, angry murmur directed not at Jane, but at the man who had been their master for so long. Croft saw the tide of public opinion turn against him in an instant. His bluster evaporated, leaving him looking smaller. His power stripped away not by a gunshot, but by a girl with a $2 deed and a book full of inconvenient truths. The judge closed the ledger with a snap. "This court will impound this evidence," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "There will be a full investigation." A month later, the evening sun cast a long golden light over Blackwood Ridge. The change was profound. The cabin stood whole and proud, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from its newly built stone chimney. The sagging porch was gone, replaced by a sturdy, level deck. Where there had been only wilderness, a small, tidy garden was now taking root under Jane's careful hand. The dark soil turned and ready for spring planting. Next to the cabin, A small, well-built corral, which Will had finished the week before, held the gentle mare he had given her. The fear had leached from the land, replaced by a palpable sense of peace, of homecoming. The federal government, guided by the ledger and the railroad agent, had moved swiftly. The bonds were recovered, and a significant portion was awarded to Jane as a finder's fee, a legal right she hadn't even known she possessed. She was no longer poor. But more importantly, she was no longer an outcast. People from Redemption Gulch now made the trip up the ridge, not to gawk or mock, but to trade eggs for repaired tools, to bring news, and to simply sit for a while on her porch and look out at the valley. She had become the quiet center of a community she had inadvertently remade. Will Kincaid rode up as dusk began to settle, dismounting not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. He came not to help, but to share in the quiet satisfaction of the evening. He leaned on the corral fence next to her, their shoulders almost touching. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky bleed from orange to violet over the distant peaks. The valley below was settling into shadow, the lights of Redemption Gulch just beginning to twinkle. "You did it, Jane," Will said softly, his voice full of a quiet admiration that meant more to her than all the money from the bonds. "You faced them all down." Jane looked from his face to the solid lines of her cabin, to the dark, tilled earth of her garden, to the vast, quiet sky. She thought of the fear she had felt on her first night, and the peace she felt now. The journey had been about more than finding a treasure. It had been about building a life. "I didn't build a fortress to keep people out," she said, her voice clear and steady in the twilight. "I just mended a home to let the right ones in." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. If you were moved by Jane's journey from outcast to anchor, please leave a like and a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the strength found in forgotten places. We'll see you next time.